Hit it.
It's Thursday, October 15, 2025, episode 276. I'm Patrick Ceresna.
And I'm Kevin Muir. This week, we have the great pleasure to welcome to the show Julien Garran from MacroStrategy. He explains why he thinks this is the biggest and most dangerous bubble we've ever seen. He walks through why he thinks not only is the pricing too optimistic, but why the AI technology will likely disappoint tech bulls. And he also hints at a trade that he likes a whole lot better. Then, in this topsy-turvy market, the need for Patrick's crayon analysis has never been greater.
The need.
Stick around for talking charts.
The need for those crayons is necessary. But listen, we're gonna stick around here because we need to talk about this beer.
Okay,
Danny, what beer are we all drinking? We coordinated this. So what is it that we're drinking?
Just first of all, it's actually October 16th, not 15th. So just to correct you there, Patrick, just so you know.
Well, you know what? That's my fault because I wrote the script for that, and Patrick is like Ron Burgundy, and he just reads whatever's there.
Exactly. And secondly,
literally Ron Burgundy.
And secondly, this is Kev's pick. So this is Mascot lightweight beer, low cal. And I love the fact that we started this all together with the strongest beer picked by Patrick. And now we're ending with a lightweight beer picked by Kevin. So it just says everything, right?
It just says everything. It's actually really nice. It's because he makes me drink this midday. So I don't want like a 9.5% beer, a nice 3 or 3.5 or whatever this is. It's a lightweight like me.
Lightweight.
It's a lightweight. You know, one of my good pals used to say this when we would go out drinking. He goes, Kev, you're a lightweight, but you never pretend that you're any different. So that's good.
All right. Kev, give us a disclaimer, buddy.
Nothing in this podcast should be viewed as investment advice. Listeners should consult an investment professional before making any decisions regarding topics mentioned in the show. Side effects of too much huddle may include the precious metal mania disorder. That's the PMMD. Yeah. Then the gold rush hysteria syndrome, the GRHS. I think a lot of folks have come down with that recently. And then finally, the silver squeeze psychosis, the SSP.
Okay, so there's a lot of precious metals there, but none of them are the FOMO one where I sold too soon. And
well, I can tell you that a lot of people are experiencing that.
Oh my God! All right, let's get to the guest.
It's our great pleasure to welcome to the show Julien Garran. He is the partner at MacroStrategy. And Julian, thank you very much for making time for us today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So, wow. When I read your piece, I was like, this is got to be one of the most, I don't know how to say it. The piece that spoke to me the most about the AI bubble that we're currently in. And I'm just going to read what you said at the beginning here. He says, this note seeks to set out the reasons why the AI bubble has grown so large, and then to draw out the forces that will end the bubble and what the aftermath will look like. Make no mistake, I think this is the biggest and most dangerous bubble the world has ever seen. The misallocation of capital in the U.S., which also includes housing, VC, and crypto, is already 17 times the dot-com bubble and 4 times the 2008 real estate bubble. And as it unwinds, it will not just threaten significant economic malaise, it will threaten to overturn the entire globalist agenda that developed with the advent of Thatcher and Reagan in 1979 and 1982, accelerated with the fall of the Berlin Wall that fell in 1988, and sped up again with China's accession into the WTO at 2002. That is some piece, and it certainly got my attention, and we're going to talk about that. But before we do, let's learn a little bit about yourself. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? Did you how you got here, your journey, and just kind of tell us, let us know who you are.
Yeah, no, sure thing. Well, I get when Rishi Sunak was the Chancellor of the Exchequer here in the UK, the finance minister, my kind of running joke was that I had a better CV than him because we both went to Winchester and Oxbridge. We both worked in top 3 investment banks and at hedge funds. But did he win the Winchester Economics Prize when he was 16? No, he didn't. And so I think history has proven that they picked the wrong man for the job. But in finance, I started out as a commodities guy. I worked with the commodities research unit I was then commodity strategist at ABN AMRO, UBS, and ran commodity funds on the buy side. And I guess for me, I was always competing against kind of other firms which had much bigger teams and so on. So I was never going to beat them by having a more detailed nickel supply demand balance or what have you. So I was always trying to kind of turn it into a macro view or try and kind of find some kind of angle. And I think that kind of probably the best bit of work I did on the sell side was in the aftermath of the great financial crisis. We'd identified that there'd been this kind of massive destocking taking place. And most people were talking about, say, maybe a 5% uptick in kind of copper or iron ore demand, or a 10% uptick. But I used the example or the analogy of a wine cellar. So if you imagine that in year one, you've got 100 bottles of wine in your cellar, you drink 100, you buy 100, and you're left with 100. So that's all fine. In year two, you're in a downturn. So you decide to drink kind of 90, but you only decide to replace, say, 50 of them. So you're down to about a stock of about 60. Now, the next year, you say, okay, well, things are improving. I'm going to drink 95, but this time I'm going to buy 95. I'm going to replace everything. And suddenly even though your year-on-year consumption is only up, 6%, your purchases are up 60% and even more. And so that kind of gave us the idea that something might happen that could be really quite exciting and unexpected. And then I worked with a guy who was covering the Brazilian iron ore maker Vale. And he was saying, well, can we actually put these numbers, into a real world, see what actually might happen to iron ore demand out of Europe? And so we did the back of the envelope numbers. And I reckoned that the demand for iron ore out of Europe should be up about 90%. So we called Vale kind of that evening and said, look, this is what we're doing. This is what it's telling us. Are you seeing anything on the ground? And they said, well, funny you should mention that. We just did our quarterly kind of iron ore demand kind of calls with all the European steelmakers, and the demand's up 100%, and we're going to have to stop selling to China. And at that point, we knew it was real, and so we went out with that the next morning to the clients, and the market went mental, and iron ore prices were up 40% in 5 weeks, and the stocks went ballistic. So that was kind of fun. It was sort of moving it beyond a traditional kind of adding up all the and dotting the I's and crossing the T's, and trying to think a bit more deeply about how the system works.
So just walk us through in terms of the timing. Like, you graduate from university? What is that? Is it early 90s or is it even earlier than that? And like, did you get a job straight on the sell side? And was it always commodities?
No, I had a bit of so I started when I was at college. I was very humanidocious, and so I decided when I left university, what I wanted to do was work with homeless people. So I did that for about 5 years in Oxford and then in London. Yeah. And then after that time, I was sort of realizing that I wasn't moving things forward that quickly, and I kind of always liked markets. And so I started thinking about kind of what market, I could re-engage my analytical brain and get into that. And I found probably the best kind of, proving ground for that kind of thing, which was a commodities research unit, which has been going since the 60s. And that was the perfect place to kind of learn the groundwork for how to properly analyze a market. And it was there, I was getting interested in these kind of how we were getting kind of supply demand balances wrong, etc. Right. And worked out an inventory kind of model which effectively accelerated the end demand effects, and that was the beginning of adding value in that way. So I did that for about 5 years, and then I joined ABN AMRO as head of commodity strategy. But I kind of moved on after sort of 5 years of that to working more on the macro side. So I became the chief kind of European equity strategist at ABN, and then I also kind of worked as a sort of macro kind of analyst on the sales desk before going onto the buy side, where I joined Legal and General. It's a big insurer here in the UK, to run their global asset allocation and then to start their macro fund. And the plan was at that point to try and make kind of more than 10% returns, completely uncorrelated with the S&P, with the idea that the average hedge fund, or if you add all the hedge funds up together, they basically make you a return of the S&P times 0.5. and so the argument is that's not that useful. You might as well just.
Let me just get this straight. You went from like helping the homeless to working as a sell side commodities analyst, basically.
Yeah, and the clients have always been needy, whichever job I've been doing. So,
Well, that was very honorable of you, and you definitely have a unique background that way. In terms of the, you must have been there for the kind of boots on the ground for the BRICS moment. What was that like, experiencing that kind of, let's just say, enthusiasm / bubble, like of the China entering and buying all these commodities? Can you tell us a little bit, if maybe share a story or two about that?
Yeah, no, sure thing. And well, before it happened, and it felt when it started happening, it felt like redemption, because before it happened, we were sitting on a mining desk. It was the European mining desk at ABN AMRO. We were next to the European kind of internet desk. And these guys were kind of, shouting their heads off about bubbles, to the point you couldn't hear the microphone. There was so much feedback. And we were sort of going, this is nonsense. None of this is real. What are they doing? And yet they were getting, the big bonuses were going in one direction, and they certainly weren't coming in our direction. So when we started seeing, and during the downturn in 2000 and into 2001, we started realizing that the next upturn could get very, very interesting indeed. And the work that I did on that was use kind of S-curve analysis. So it's this idea that the intensity of use. So when at that point, my report was called the $5,000 question, which was when someone in an emerging market gets to about $5,000 income PPP, they can start to afford to live in an apartment with kind of electricity and running water. And then the desire to step up and buy the modcons, the boiler, the kitchen set, the bathroom set, the toilet and the moped and the car, etc., is huge. The kind of incentive to better yourself, to work hard is massive. And you go through this incredible intensity of use kind of switch, gears change. And so we saw that coming. And that kind of explained this explosion in resource demand that we saw. And what's quite interesting in the current world is that India is in almost exactly the same position today as China was in 2000, 2001, in that it's got this burgeoning middle-class population. Now the report is called the $10,000 to $15,000 question because of inflation, but the idea is exactly the same. And I'm using basically the same analysis that I used back in 2001 to argue that India could see we could see an extraordinary increase in the intensity of use of resources as India's middle class moves into and then along this $10,000 to $15,000 income bracket. And just to put it in context, it took from about 1890 to 1970 to get around 180 million Americans through the kind of whole modcon kind of entering the middle class, buying the getting the toilet and the hot water and stuff, going through that whole middle class kind of process. That we're going to see about 240 million people in India go through that process over 5 years. So this is a potential massive global game changer.
Why do you think the market is not talking about that story? You'd think that would be kind of front page story, and it's not by any means.
It isn't, and I think part of the thing is, and similarly, they weren't talking about the story in China back in 2001. I remember kind of like the front page of The Economist at the time saying that China, couldn't expand because the banks were bust and corrupt, and they'd missed, which may have been true, but it wasn't. It didn't actually stop it. Didn't actually stop it from happening. And so I think it's a sort of similar thing. The focus is elsewhere. But actually, I think this is probably going to be one of the most important. It's going to be the most important development in quantitative terms, in terms of raising people's living standards. It's going to be the most important event in history in terms of doing that, if we see this happen over the next 10 years.
Okay, so let's get to the topic du jour, the bubble that we're in on the AI. And I've had the good fortune to, hear you speak about this. So I know you're well versed and you have a whole kind of presentation. So instead of me kind of peppering you with questions, I'm going to actually let you go. So we're going to pull up the slides, and why don't you just kind of lay out the thesis for us? I'll jump in and, when needed, but otherwise you go ahead and tell your story, because it's a terrific story.
Sure thing. Okay. So I've been following AI kind of closely from well before kind of ChatGPT was kind of launched kind of back in kind of November 22. I've been looking at how AI has been developing and how useful it may or may not be. Over that time, I've come up with a kind of golden rule, and especially since the advent of the large language models with ChatGPT and Anthropic, etc. And my golden rule is, if you use a large language model to develop an app or a service, it'll never be commercial. You'll never be able to make a return off doing that. And there's a range of reasons why that's true. The first set of reasons was that it was kind of built to fail, in that the way that they've built it, it can become a very good simulacrum of language, and to a lesser degree of pictures, and a much lesser degree for videos, but it can't ever actually apply cognitive intelligence. And the places where people do find it useful, which is kind of coders, for instance, accessing large amounts of data, or kind of in some cases people using the video functions to shortcut a more expensive kind of image creation process. In those cases, the fact that large language models have hit a scaling wall means that the cost of providing all the compute to service those needs is greater than what people are prepared to pay. So it's getting kind of squeezed from both sides. And I think, we're starting to see the fallout from this, if you watch closely, in that when ChatGPT 5 was launched, it was kind of widely perceived as being a flop because it wasn't significantly better than previous versions. Yet they'd spent, on my estimates, up to 80 to 100 times more compute on building it. So that starts to raise questions. And what we've also seen is that the developers of large language models have started talking about a pivot to, naturally, if something's not working, if you're a kind of California startup, you pivot. And the pivot was, first of all, to kind of reinforcement learning. That was in August. But Toby Ord, the kind of computer engineer, pointed out that to get one bit of knowledge, if you like, from reinforcement learning takes 1,000 to 1,000,000 times more compute than even a large language model, which is using too much compute anyway. So that was seen as too expensive. And they're now moving to talking about using world models. So this is just 2 months later, they've changed again, talking about using world models, which are like synthetic physics kind of correlated kind of models of how you move around the world. But again, and I'll talk about this a bit later, these things are very limited. You can't learn how the world works from a model that doesn't include everything about how the world works. And so what I might just sort of highlight is the elements that make this happen. And within that, I think the big issue is that this is a misallocation of capital. This is a huge amount of investment taking place that's not making a return on the cost of capital. And that's hugely important for the economy, for society as a whole, because the capital stock is the foundation for basically the entire economy. Everyone's hopes and prospects all depend on a capital stock that makes a return. And so if you divert the size of funds away from the real economy into something that doesn't make a return, then you're basically taking away the prospects for the economy and for the world. And that's clearly happening. When we look at bank lending this year, there's been no bank lending growth to the real economy. It's all been into the financialized economy, to non-bank financial or non-depository taking financial institutions, a chunk of which has been diverted into chips. And the way that we measure this misallocation is that we use a Wixell spread. So Nut Wixell was an economist kind of from a bit over 100 years ago. He's Swedish. And he argued that the key to capitalism, key to allocating capital, was getting a neutral rate of interest, which was, the cost of debt for the average corporate should be a couple of percentage points above the growth of nominal GDP, which is kind of the return on the economy as a whole. And if you set rates at that level, then business people who know their own business, if they think they can make a return over the cost of debt, they'll borrow and they'll expand. If they don't think they'll make a return, they'll run for cash and they'll shrink. And that way, capital is allocated as well as it possibly can be by the people who are closest to their businesses and their businesses' potential profits and losses. And that gives you not only the fastest growth you can get, but it also means the highest returns that you can get. And it also means the biggest kind of surplus that you can use to invest in growing the capital stock to improve the economy for everyone going forward. Now, the problem with this is that if you interfere with it, and my view is that Powell interfered with it more than anyone else in history during 2001, when he was running QE with zero rates, when the nominal economy was growing at 11%. And what that did was it created on the bottom right there a Wixell spread that had gone massively negative. That means it's hugely stimulatory to people, and it incentivizes them to basically, people and companies, to gear up to buy and build assets. And the thing about this particular kind of post kind of COVID kind of stimulus and then gradual withdrawal of stimulus is a lot of the stimulus was kind of side pocketed and then bled into the economy a bit later. So about 1.3 trillion of the fiscal stimulus was saved and then spent down over 22, 23 and into 24. 2 trillion of the monetary stimulus went into reverse repo, still there by the end of 22, came out over the next couple of years, etc. So this thing kind of lasted for 5 years. Now, the danger with this is that when you do this, the assets get priced to perfection, but then later in the cycle, when rates go up and growth slows and spreads widen, the Wixell spread goes above 2%, which it's just doing right now.
Okay.
And at that point, you start to see the assets impaired and the debt and equity behind them damaged. And that's the danger, is that we're just getting into the zone now where the Wixell dynamics are going wrong. And that's why we're kind of sounding the alarm, because this is the first time since the pandemic that we're actually at a point where the Wixell spread is saying, look, it's time to be careful about misallocated capital. And in terms of the size of the misallocation, it's now reached cumulatively about 65%, just over 65% of US GDP. This is about 17 times bigger than the dot-com bubble and about 4 times bigger than the real estate and credit bubble that preceded the GFC. Now, this isn't just tech, this isn't just AI, it's also kind of real estate, it's also crypto, it's non-fungible tokens, etc. But all of these things together create a very substantial risk to an economy that looks kind of placid on the surface. Underneath, there are all sorts of weaknesses there. Now, that gets me to the kind of issues around kind of large language model AI. And I'll talk about, I think I'll go straight into talking about why they were built to fail, and then the scaling issues. And so in terms of why they were built to fail, basically what they do when they build a large language model is they give each word in a language a vector. And a vector for you or I, like if we were talking about where we are in the world, we'd need three numbers: our longitude, our latitude, and our height above sea level. And if I subtracted my vector from yours, we'd know exactly how far apart we were. So it's a useful kind of tool in a kind of narrow kind of application. What they've done with large language models is they've given each word, say 60,000 words, a vector. ChatGPT-3 had 12,440 numbers or dimensions per vector. And then they train it. And what the training does, it goes through a transformer. So they basically train it on a large amount of data on the net, goes through a transformer, and the transformer works out the correlations between each of the numbers. And what you end up with is a thing that can work out how words are statistically related to each other. So cat is quite closely related to dog because they're both pets, both have 4 legs and a tail and so on. Both cat and dog are quite closely related to running because they both do that, but they're related obviously in a different way because that's what they do. But dogs tend to run in the park and cats are more likely to run in the garden and so on. And what that then allows is for the large language model to come up with a good prediction of what the next word is likely to be in a coherent sentence. And it's allowed them to create a very effective kind of simulacrum of language. But you can tell by the way that they've done it that that isn't actually language. That isn't a person with an intention of kind of transferring a meaning and trying to get something done to someone else. This is just a statistical process. And that's the sort of hidden heart of why this may be a problem. And one kind of thing that sort of comes out of this, now this is the one strand on which they're working. The other strand that they work along is rote learning. So what people found was that these large language models, could create coherent sentences, but sometimes they would give good answers and sometimes they wouldn't give good answers. And so they've put in overlays, and the overlays are kind of rote learning overlays. So there are companies that will, go and find people in a distressed nation, pay them a few cents an hour to come up with model answers to likely questions. So they overlay those. Now, the problem with that is if you asked a kid what's the structure of an atom, and that kid has access to a reference library, does it matter if the kid has a deep understanding of atomic physics and has answered based on knowledge, or has just copied it out of the encyclopedia? And the answer is it does matter, because you might be able to ask one more question, like kind of why is uranium radioactive? And it might be able to copy that out of the encyclopedia. But if you ask a less common question, like why is fermium radioactive, or americium radioactive, which isn't in the encyclopedia, the encyclopedia copying kid is going to be all at sea. Whereas the kid who's got a deep understanding of atomic physics is going to be able to answer your question. And because life is messy, if you're outside the constraints of a very narrow application, the chances are you're going to come across one of these types of unasked questions really quite quickly. And that's where these things start falling down. And so I gave the example. So once you know that's how they kind of work, it's quite easy to think of questions that they're going to struggle with. So, for instance, I asked my image LLM to do a picture of a photorealistic picture of a chessboard, one move before white wins. Now, this picture is a catastrophe. Number one, you could never get a chessboard looking like that during a normal game. Number two, there's only 7 squares on the front and back edges. This is useless, yet these LLMs have been trained on more chess books than any human could read in a lifetime, and more chess games than any person could play out in a lifetime. And why has it got it wrong? Well, it's got it wrong because that's not a question people ask. People might ask, can you play a game of chess? But they don't, no one really asks to put a chessboard up. I've not seen anyone ask that question before. And so it's lost because it's not got anything to correlate with. And secondly, even though it's been trained on all these books, it's not been trained to understand the meaning of the book to teach you how to play chess. It's been trained to understand the relationship between all the words in the book. And so this dual process of understanding the correlation of words and rote learning doesn't work for something dynamic like that. And the further away you get from the abstract of language, and the closer you get to the physical world reality, and in a sense, pictures are one step towards reality, videos are another step towards, and then you get the actual physical world to operate in. The closer you get, the worse it gets. And for a long time, when you asked the video creating kind of LLMs to do a video of gymnasts, they would have a real problem, i.e. the limbs would be all over the place, extra limbs would grow during the video, like in the image in the bottom right, because it doesn't fundamentally understand human physiognomy and that there are constraints on movement for human bodies. And so the first set of problems is that you have a limit to what this could be applied to. And what can you use a regurgitation machine that sometimes gets it wrong for? Well, you can use it for for instance, homework, because homework is just regurgitation. My daughter brought some homework home when she was 15, and I recognised that it's exactly the same homework I had when I was 15. It's like Latin homework. It hadn't changed. Same textbook, same questions. And you look at that and go, it's got no value. So yes, they can regurgitate it. But it doesn't have, homework has no commercial value, and you'd argue all the value of homework is in the doing of it, whether it be the learning the discipline, learning the content, etc. And if you sidestep that, then you destroy any intrinsic value in doing the homework. And then you say, well, how about coding? Because that's sort of widely touted as the best use. But the problem is you get kind of, if you ask it to do something, you can get it to recreate a video game like a shoot 'em up or a breakout or what have you. But it's kind of buggy, and it wouldn't fit in with your broader software stack. It's just copied the code that it's been taught on, and so you couldn't commercialize it because the game's already out there. It's probably used copyright code, etc. And so again, you run short of the requirements for a commercial, a killer app, a very popular, profitable app. Now, the next issue is the issue of scaling. So because of the way these vectors work, if you want to go the next level and make your large language model more accurate and put more numbers in your vector, train it on bigger data and use more compute, the problem is that the benefit of having a bit bigger sort of vector, like 12,441 numbers in it, is that your benefits from that are at best linear, and not even that if you're running into the statistical limits of language. Yet your costs, you have to basically recalculate every single correlation within not just the one word vector, but in every other word vector and between every number of every word vector. And so your costs just go right through the ceiling while your benefits go flat and flat and flat. Now, that didn't matter when all you were using was your PC at the lower numbers, because your hard disk and the compute kind of that you've got available to you, in a sense, was just there. It didn't have any cost. But once you get into data center size requirements, the costs are just astronomical. And that's basically where we've got to. And while that's a theoretical argument that you're going to hit a scaling wall, and this is a chart from Toby Ord, the reality is that ChatGPT 3 cost 50 million, was released in kind of November 2022. ChatGPT 4 cost 500 million and was released in March of 2023. They were planning to spend 5 billion on 5 and release it in Q3 of 2023. But when we got to that point, insiders, and there's been reports from Reuters and The Information talking to OpenAI insiders, were saying that this thing isn't actually sufficiently better than the previous version to justify the 10 times higher cost. So they kept on running it on various training runs. I estimate they used 80 to 100 times more compute on the Ultimate 5. They initially released it as 4.5 than they did on 4. And yet it's not much better than what's out there. And so you then have this problem that if people are using it rather than just for regurgitation, but they're using it to get hold of cheap compute, which is what some coders do. There's a subreddit kind of top 10 list of the people who've managed to extract the most amount of compute out of a $200 monthly subscription to Anthropic's kind of coding app, and the winner or the winning kind of number at the moment is someone's got $10,200 or so of compute out for $200, and so Anthropic's then like kind of hemorrhaging money from these guys, and this is so completely different from software as we know it, where Microsoft, the cost of Microsoft's first Excel might have been $100,000, but their second sale didn't cost them $1, and it goes down to less than a cent. This is the opposite of that. When you start scaling it, it actually costs an increasing amount, and so you can't get returns on that other wing of potential uses either. And that applies then to people making videos and images, and videos are just rife with errors, and so you end up with a problem that people will just keep on redoing them until eventually they get something that doesn't look immediately like it's error ridden. But by the time they've done that, they've used massive amounts of compute, which is why, for instance, Sora only allows you to do a 10-second video, because if they allowed you to do anything longer, you'd get into all sorts of trouble. And likewise, there's all sorts of questions that you can ask that kind of get it working too hard. So if you try, and I tried one which didn't work, which is I said count from 1 to infinity minus 1, and it just said no, we're not doing that, because that if they hadn't put a block on that, then OpenAI would have gone bust when I put the question on. But if you ask a slightly different question, like draw me the architectural schematics for a new kind of 10 million person city just outside Dubai, it's not necessarily going to know that it has to stop. And so they have to put all these constraints on to try and stop it wasting huge amounts of compute. And those fundamentally are the limits. And I might kind of pause for breath there.
Sure, no problem. I'm going to jump in because, you were doing great. I didn't want to bug you and interrupt, but one of the things that I think is amazing about your research and your view is that a lot of folks will talk about the price of the stocks and the assets for AI as being overpriced. And there's very few people that are actually looking at the technology and saying, no, not only is the assets overpriced compared to where they, what the market is putting in there, but you're also saying it's not as good as everyone thinks. And it's not as transformative. It's not as revolutionary. And one of the things that I just guess when people are listening to this, they're going to wonder, well, what does he see that the rest of the folks don't see? Like, why are you having this outside the box view about this? Whereas meanwhile, everyone else is telling us that this is the second coming, the most important thing since the wheel and yada, yada, yada. Yeah. Where do you think the disconnect becomes, and how did we get here?
To be honest, I think this disconnect exists across a whole range of areas where, especially, and even down to what I was saying earlier about the capital stock and misallocation of capital, that there's very little understanding, throughout most of school. You're not taught that stuff, and so people don't understand the foundation for why society and civilization actually exists. And we're not very different. We're no more intelligent than our ancestors who lived in caves in Europe, and yet we live these very different lives, both in terms of the the comfort that we live in, but also the opportunity that we face. And yet there's very little understanding in the public domain about what that is and why the capital stock and why a strong capital stock is behind it. So I'm not surprised. And this stuff is, it's partly because in the modern world, we have an attention deficit issue. I was giving an interview with a newspaper, national newspaper in the UK, The Telegraph, one time. And I was chatting to one of the journalists there, and they said that, and I was asking, what her kind of daily routine was. She was a junior, and her routine was writing 8 articles that she'd mainly kind of paraphrased from the wires. And you're sort of going, that's not journalism. that's just repeating stuff.
Right.
And so if you don't have the time, and in a soundbite culture, it's quite hard to get to the point where you're going, so you use this thing, right? To ask, it's like an Aristotelian kind of set of questions to help someone get to the truth. And so one example was, I've got a good friend who started using it. So he thought AIs had a series of uses. And one of the things he was doing, he didn't know how to use Python. So if you want to interrogate a large data set, you kind of need to know how to use the Python coding language to do it. And what these large language models have allowed you to do is interrogate the data set without having to learn Python. So he was doing that.
Okay.
And one of the issues that I have is that one of the reasons large language models are successful is because it looks about right. Most of the time, the answer looks about right. And so it's very easy to go, oh, well, that is right then, and I'll move on. Whereas if you actually go in and test it rigorously, which takes a lot of time, it means you have to do all the work yourself in parallel, then you find out that it's not right all the time. And so he did this by accident because he uploaded, he was uploading different data sets and asking the to do correlations on them, so he could look at how electricity prices would move with macro signals, for instance. And he did, and by accident, he uploaded the same data set a second time, but it gave different answers. And so he suddenly realized, okay, so I don't know if all the previous answers were right because they look reasonable, but then so does this. And so you get stuck. And I think probably the best study that I've seen was out of Stanford, kind of led by Professor Frank Zhu, and it was called the Agent Company. And so what he did was he recreated a software company. Software company is probably going to be the most accessible for a large language model to try and do the jobs. And he broke down all the tasks you'd need to run a software company, and they had something like 486 or something. And then he got a range of large language model agents to do the tasks. And he found that the success rate ranged between 1.5%, which is obviously completion rate, which was Grok, which at the time Elon Musk was saying was Grok 2, which was the greatest LLM ever, up to about 34%. Now, 34% would be useful if it was consistent, because you could then automate a third of all the tasks of the company, and that would be valuable. The problem is it's not consistent. It's a different 34% every time you run the system, because it's a probabilistic system, and it runs into these issues where it kind of hits a question it's not been asked before, which just happens in business. And so that for me is it's because it looks all right that a lot of people accept it. And because they don't have the time to test it, they accept it.
The other thing
if you take that time.
Yeah, sorry. The other thing I thought was interesting when I heard you speak before was you mentioned that part of the problem is it asserts these things. It gives you these answers, and it doesn't put confidence intervals on it. So there could be something that has a 95% confidence interval, and it'll look the same as something that it really just thinks has a 30% confidence interval. It's always forced to come up with an answer.
Yeah, and that's an issue of how it was put into the public domain. So this was something that that the large language model is effectively aware of whether it's been trained on an answer. Okay, so it's got to kind of do two things when it tries to come up with an answer. Number one, it's got to try and find the meaning in the question. So it's got to kind of parse the question down and work out how closely connected that is to the rote answers it's got, or to the other training answers that it's got. And that's not always completely easy. And so once it's done that, if it's a pretty close correlation, which in a sense it will know because it goes through a neural net, and you get, in a sense, a bit like a neurons firing. If you get a lot of neurons firing, it tells you that's the likely thing that's going to be right. But then it'll have others that are marginal. But what the developers found was that if you have a system that comes out and frequently says, I'm not really sure, people have less confidence in it. And it's a psychological thing that people find unconfident people, or other people who are unconfident, less convincing than people who are confident. Now, what we obviously in markets, we have to realize that just because someone's confident doesn't mean they're right, and it could be actually more dangerous if they're confident than if they're less confident. But that aside, and so they've allowed that to run, because otherwise less people would use it and they wouldn't get funding. And so, in a sense, it's disingenuous, and it's one of its major.
Now, the other thing I've noticed is I saw that study or that paper that said that coders, when you actually look at it, they weren't any faster using AI, and that it was actually something like it took them 120% of the time, because they had to go fix the errors, and it was, to your point, it wasn't as good as they had expected. And I just want to bring it back to this question, like we're talking about all these things that are wrong with it, yet we have Zuckerberg, Elon, all these folks just rushing out and spending huge amounts of money. So they obviously have a different view than you. Yeah. Where does that kind of come from, and why are they doing that?
Okay, so in the first instance, when you ask an LLM to do some coding for you, it immediately looks impressive, because within a minute of you asking the question, or a couple of minutes, it's written 200 lines of code, and normally the code kind of does something. And so, especially for a non-coder or a sort of amateur coder, that's manna from heaven. It's been a lot quicker. The difficulty is then that it's buggy, and that it's kind of potentially very open to hacking or disruption, or just not consistent enough, and what have you. So it's useful if you're hobby coding, like if you want to create a small app for your fossil collection or whatever you might have. But if you actually want to put this thing in the public domain, it's just nowhere close. And if you want to connect it in with a broader kind of stack of programs and models, it's just not good enough. And so it turns out to be a false economy. The speed at the front end is made up by all sorts of work you have to do if you want to commercialize it at the back end. Now, there are some exceptions to this, and so this is where the question of how broadly useful it is comes in, because you could argue quite reasonably that there are some jobs out there that are kind of bullshit jobs. and so parts of HR, for instance, if you're the person who's in charge of sifting through the CVs for someone, for a company, how do they know whether you've done that job properly? They just get the sort of smaller number of potential candidates. How do they know whether you've left a diamond in the sort of in the dustbin? And the answer is they don't know. And so no one can actually kind of work out whether these people are doing their job properly or not. There's an argument. There's a book out kind of last year arguing that management consultants are mainly operating off hype, and they're actually a dead weight on society and aren't generating useful work. And then there's also an argument that monopolies are a problem, because the standard textbook understanding of a monopoly is that a monopoly can raise their price. They're price inelastic. They raise their price and not that many people stop buying, and so they get these monopoly profits. But it also works in another way, which is they can cut their costs and lower their quality, and not many people leave because they don't have a choice, and so they can maximize their profits that way as well. And that's what ultimately I think is happening. I think that some jobs where people aren't testing or don't know whether the work is good or not, like HR or consultancies or possibly marketing kind of programs and what have you, I think people are substituting bullshit with bullshit, and so yeah, okay, but it's not great value. And then another area is if you're in a sufficiently strong market position that you can allow your quality to go down, then you can employ an AI to do that. And you know what we're seeing at the moment is, and Amazon yesterday said they were firing people, Microsoft have been firing people, and so on. And what seems to be happening is that they're losing people in the States. They're then using an AI to run a first pass on their work. And then they're getting someone offshore to basically clean up the slop and clean up the mess. Now, the end result of that is that the product isn't as good, but they don't really mind because their cost is less and they make more profit. And so I think, yes, it has those narrow applications, but when you look at kind of broader businesses outside the sort of big seven, you can see that adoption, after a couple of years of trying these things, adoption is actually rolling off here on that chart on the right there. It's actually declining, while the likes of Meta and Microsoft, you know, may be using it, but not necessarily for kind of genuinely useful things, just purely to cut costs, even at the expense of quality.
Right. Now, you mentioned Microsoft. One of the things that I've heard you talk about is the fact that Nadella is recently stepped away from their expansion, or the pace of their expansion into AI. And I was wondering if you could just expand on that and why this might be kind of the canary, you know, singing in the coal mine.
Yeah, no, sure thing. So there's been, and it hasn't just been the large language model companies that have caught the public attention. What we've also seen is that the cloud companies have been doing very well, and they've been booking large amount, you know, very large revenue growth. And Microsoft obviously is right in the heart of that. Now, what Microsoft has been doing is basically been selling OpenAI kind of compute time in return for equity, and then booking that compute time as revenue. And then because OpenAI has been going through kind of funding rounds at higher prices, Microsoft can book that as mark-to-market rise in the value of their investments. And that just looks fantastic. However, probably no one else outside of OpenAI knows more about OpenAI than Nadella, given the large equity that Microsoft holds in the business. And he was surely completely aware that ChatGPT 5 was meant to be coming out in Q3 of kind of 2023, and that they had to keep spending more and more on it to try and get it to be sufficiently better to be worth releasing. And yet that wasn't working. And then he's also aware that, you know, if you did happen to make a better LLM that was a step above everything else that was out there, that there are systems that you can employ, which is what kind of DeepSeek did, the Chinese company, which is you can use an LLM to create these synthetic data to train another LLM that's almost as good, but which is much more efficient. And so you kind of lose your moat. Even if you were able to do it, you'd lose your moat, and they weren't able to do it. And so my view is that while he keeps promoting this, because it's good for Microsoft, if OpenAI keeps raising more funds at ever higher levels, it's good for their investment. But I think he's deeply aware that that they've hit a scaling wall. And that's why he announced a Microsoft pivot, and also said at the same time, 4 or 5 months ago, that OpenAI was pivoting to products rather than training.
Right.
Because clearly they're not seeing the benefit from training anymore. And then the problem then is that the products aren't much good because you use these agents that OpenAI launched, sort of amusingly, sort of one day after the DeepSeek announcement earlier this year. Its agent called Operator. I watched the sort of launch of that, and they were talking about what it could do. It's meant to be able to, order your groceries, buy your tickets to a ball game, get you a pizza, and all that kind of stuff. And they got about sort of 20 minutes into this presentation, and then showed it against benchmarks, and it was completing these tasks 1/3 of the time. And you're sort of going, that's terrible. Like if you order a pizza. And then it either just doesn't order it, which is just a waste of your time, or else it sort of orders it and it's delivered to your other house or whatever, your home, not your office, or whatever it does. And then you're in in this hell of trying to get your money back.
Right.
And so that's clearly what's been happening. And ultimately what it reflects is that the ecosystem, the AI ecosystem, is reflective of this lack of ability to make returns, in that only really NVIDIA making the chips, and maybe to a much lesser extent some of the training companies doing these model answers, are making any money at all. And everyone else is losing money hand over fist.
Okay.
And that's why... that's where we get to the next issue of price.
I was going to talk about this because I think that we should bring it to some numbers, because you do have not just a skepticism about the technology, but you also have a skepticism about the numbers. And there's a lot of great stuff that you've highlighted there. One of the things that you said is if you're a large data center, you can't make money. You're pretty well guaranteed a loss. Could you walk us through the math for these folks and what the problem is there?
Yeah, no, sure thing. So basically, it's possible to work out. So kind of, if you think of the strata of different AI companies, you've got NVIDIA making the chips. You've got these public data centers like CoreWeave and Lambda, along with the data centers within the majors, but you don't get much data out of those on what they're doing. And then on top of that, you have the developers like OpenAI and Anthropic. And then on top of that, you get some software companies that are providing kind of front end things using like a kind of coding app using a large language model. So if an ecosystem is healthy, like say the residential property market in London is healthy, you'd reckon you should be able to buy an apartment or a house and rent it out and make a small profit. Okay, so that would be indicative of a healthy ecosystem. And likewise, if the AI ecosystem is healthy, these companies, CoreWeave, Lambda, etc., Hyperbolic, should be able to buy the chips and rent them out and make a bit of a profit. Now, we can work out whether they are or not, because we know that the cost of a Blackwell is around $50,000. We know it costs an extra $25,000 to put the thing into a data center, because you not only have to build the data center, you have to build an incredibly advanced cooling system, because each chip uses about the same power as 4 houses. So that's and you've got kind of anything from 8 to 32 to 64 of these things in a stack. So that's some proper cooling you need. And then you've got to provide the electricity, and you've got a CPU to manage the workload, and some people working in the data center to make sure everything's going okay. So that's your extra 25 grand. Now, when you build a business like that, you'd be going, okay, well, number one, I've got to cover and then the next issue is how long do they last? Now, I think this is the sort of Achilles heel of the whole ecosystem, which is that these chips, they're not like fiber optic cable that lasted for 30, 40 years. These things degrade at about 1% a month. And there are new versions, and kind of NVIDIA has promised new, faster, more advanced versions on an annual basis. And so the value of these chips actually should depreciate much faster than the 6 years or so that the majors and some of these data centers are using. I think a fair number would be about 2.5 years. Now, you can work out, because you've got to pay the cost of debt, you're expecting a return, maybe 10% a year, because you've got the potential for voids and for burnouts. You can work out, and that's what I've done in this chart on the left there, how much, and also you add in the cost of electricity, how much should they be renting it out to make a reasonable 10% annual return? And the answer is $6.31 an hour. Now, I waited all year to try and find a publicly available Blackwell, because there were lots of delays because of problems with the cooling. But finally in July, Lambda started publishing kind of rental prices for Blackwells. Well, it's $3.79 an hour. So you're not making a return, you're making 25% loss. And that's not a business. And the only way that becomes a business is if there is some extraordinary breakthrough with large language model training, that it becomes, an AGI, that it becomes actually conscious. And so the demand for training goes through the roof again. Now, back in Q2 of 2023, the demand was going through the roof because everyone wanted to build an image AI. So at that point, an H100 was renting for about $8, and you could make your money back in about 15 months, and then everything else would be gravy. So that was, that at that point, if those prices were going to hold, that looked like a decent thing to do. But today, with that absent, and I think it stays absent, you're guaranteed a loss. And so at that point, you're going, this is just heading for a brick wall. And I think the costs are going to, it's going to end up costing these companies a lot of money, because they're suddenly going to have to start showing a realistic depreciation schedule, at which point their losses are going to go through the roof. And that was why in 2001, when the economy had a relatively mild recession, a sort of 1% recession, corporates saw profits go down kind of 35 to 40% roughly. And that was because of all these write-offs that took place around kind of .com infrastructure investment. I think the same thing is set up when this begins to roll over as well.
And that was the vendor financing. And could you talk a little bit about that period with the Cisco and the Nortels and the Lucents of the world, and how that might look like what we might see going forward here?
Yeah, no, sure thing. So the interesting thing about 2000, so kind of the tech bust happened in 2 stages. The first stage was that after pumping liquidity into the system, because of concerns around Y2K, Greenspan then started taking it out in February of kind of 2000. And so you saw the NASDAQ peak in March. But the process of investing in the internet at the corporate level continued. And during that period, Cisco, which was the leading company providing internet infrastructure, all the routers and switches, it was kind of ramping up its vendor financing. And so its vendor financing, its receivables went up about 138% over the course of about 15 months. But then by the time we got to November, Cisco started to realize that their customers, who they were offering decent credit terms to, were running short of cash. And so they started getting nervous, and then they pulled the plug, and then the whole thing went. And even though Cisco was a great company and very well managed, its shares still went down over 90%. Now, when you look at what's going on at NVIDIA, it kind of puts that in the shade, in that NVIDIA's receivables are up 626% over 30 months, which is an extraordinary amount. Now, obviously, the natural pushback to that would be, but their revenues are going up fast. And that is true, they are. But back at the beginning of that period, their receivables were around 55% of quarterly revenue. And given a receivable normally has a 3-year kind of time frame, that's a reasonable comparison. But now they're 85%. And what NVIDIA has been doing is selling chips and renting them back. And the question is, why are they doing that? And what are they doing with that compute? And the answer is that they were setting up a process, basically this global model stuff, so that people could train kind of robots and driverless cars on these models, with a view that that would help them, they'd be able to do it quicker than real life training. But the danger here is that those are quite small ecosystems. You don't have that many companies trying to train driverless cars. You don't, the robot ecosystem, like the autonomous robot ecosystem, is small. And there's a big problem with these models, these real world models, is that, even if you're a pixel out, or pixel different, they can learn very different things. So they're actually very fragile. And the further problem is that they don't understand how objects work, which is kind of quite fundamental. So for most of Western civilization, say, call it from the beginning, from kind of year zero through to about 80 years ago, it was driven by a Western philosophy that defined objects as being kind of discrete. They had physical properties, like if it was dry, therefore it wasn't wet, and if it was hard, it wasn't soft, and it wouldn't disappear if it went behind something, and so on. And people were very happy with that. And then Heidegger came out about 80, 90 years ago and said, well, just a minute, actually, the way you should define an object is how it's used, how people use it, how it can be turned into a tool of some kind. And that, to understand an object in that way, requires a much deeper understanding of how the world works and how humanity interacts with the physical world, and it's much, much more difficult to achieve. Those things aren't in the world models. They're using the old kind of philosophy. They're not using a new one that understands how things can be used. And so the problem with all of this is that that's not a big market, and there's a real question about whether NVIDIA is able to kind of use that compute, or whether it's just in a process of kind of round tripping to try and keep the game going. And that's the concern, is that process of kind of round tripping, which I did an example for CoreWeave after the CoreWeave IPO in March, of all the various investments that have taken place, either via Magnetar Capital. So CoreWeave, for instance, bought into a Magnetar Capital fund that geared up, raised more money, and then bought compute from CoreWeave. Magnetar also organised all the they, by the way, invented the CDO, so they've got some history. They also kind of organised the bond that is like extraordinary kind of yields that CoreWeave has used to speed up. NVIDIA kind of basically invested $1 billion on the eve of the IPO to help get the thing done. In return, CoreWeave bought 7.5 billion of GPUs from NVIDIA, was then promised 1.3 billion of takeoff for compute over the next 4 years. And you look at all that and go, this is starting to raise red flags. And then the final kind of red flag is what's happening to insider selling. And Bloomberg has a useful kind of ticker, GPTR, where you can look at insider buying and selling of a stock. Those are, it's all one way for NVIDIA all year. You can get a similar picture out of CoreWeave once they were able to sell kind of after a certain gap after the IPO. And you kind of go, well, if this was real, if this was actually going to be a killer app and incredibly useful and transformative and so on, you'd want to stay in there. You wouldn't want to be selling hand over fist. And for me, that's a final set of red flags that sort of compounds the issue, not just of the price and whether these guys can make any money, and so far they can't, but then also about the deeper questions about whether this is ever going to be more than narrowly useful.
Okay, and we're getting late, so I'll just ask you a couple quick ones here. What would be the signs that you're wrong? Like, what would you worry about if you saw XYZ happen that would make you reconsider your thesis?
And there's 2 or 3 ways I could be wrong. And the most fundamental way that I could be wrong is if the new pivots that the companies are making towards trying to find different overlays that kind of work as an intelligence, if one of those actually works, then I'm wrong. I can't see it. I don't see how they do that. I think that the work required to create a system that would actually be able to use world models effectively is a long, long way away. And it's as much an issue of understanding as it is of brute force and investment. The second way is that someone manages to work out some kind of useful way of using it that I haven't thought of before. And probably a bit more than just a sort of fad game. You'd need to be able to come up with an app that's wildly popular and profitable and doesn't run into scaling issues. So if one of those appears, then I'm going to be wrong, because then you're going to start needing to use the compute again to a much greater degree. We haven't seen it.
Right.
I think one of the big problems with the AI ecosystem is everyone's marking their own homework. None of the stuff, whenever they claim successes and things, none of it's been something in the public domain that you can just go and test for yourself, because all of these things end up running into some kind of problem. And then I guess the most likely way that I'm wrong is that this just carries on longer than I would expect, and it's sort of starting to do that already, and that's difficult because that's the bit. And I can point to there being less VC funding available, and I can point to there being being a very narrow group of investors. And it looks like, even sort of country investors are struggling. So, for instance, you might expect the Saudi Arabian Sovereign Wealth Fund to buy in, but Saudi Arabia has had to cut social benefits because they're not making enough of a return on their oil sales. So they're not going to have an infinite amount of money to spend. Now, Sayoshi-san, who put in a very large commitment kind of late last year, early this year, has been struggling to fund it. He's had to borrow against his shares in order to do the first tranche. He's got another 2/3 to go. It's not obvious how he does it. And now we're sort of in this sort of environment where we're having all these kind of cross deals where OpenAI is taken over from Microsoft, NVIDIA's taken over from Microsoft, offering OpenAI compute for equity, and all of those things. And you're going, this feels very last gasp, but that doesn't mean it doesn't go on for a bit longer. It just, everything I've seen is telling me that there are so many red flags. I don't want to invest in it, but you have to be, if you're a much shorter term trader, if you're a family office, you can go, fine, I'm going to walk away. I'm going to invest in resources in India because that's the thing for the next 10 years. But if you're in a 3-month kind of investment pod, you've got to be much more careful about trading it. And I would have all sorts of stops and technical kind of trading systems in place to make sure I didn't lose too much money while being skeptical of this thing.
Got it. Well, listen, Julian, I could do this all day, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So we're going to finish up here with our Desert Island Trader Edition. Sure. As people know, this is something, if you were put on a desert island, much like the BBC show, we're going to make you pick 3 different albums or bands, and then a trader through history that you would most likely want to share that time with. So let's start with your 3 albums or bands. What do you got for us?
Okay, well, So I'm into music. When I was 17, I traveled around the States with a friend, kind of searching for the blues. We spent the whole of the kind of Austin Blues Festival at Antone's Blues Bar, and I saw Hubert Sumlin, who's the guitar player for Howling Wolf.
Okay.
Kind of play live there. So I'd probably have to pick one of the Howling Wolf albums because of that.
Okay.
I guess. And now my other 2 choices are probably going to be a bit sort of, defensive in that I love Kind of Blue, the Miles Davis album. I think it reminds me of kind of reading books on Sunday afternoons, and I would definitely have that there. And then Blonde on Blonde by Bob Dylan. I think
great album.
Electric, yeah, just extraordinary. And so those are the 3 albums, and then as a trader, it would have to be Jesse Livermore, just because Reminiscences of a Stock Operator was kind of the most influential book on in my kind of trading lifetime. And I think the bit about it I like the most is the chapter about this guy. He's sort of moved from the bucket shops, which I guess the equivalent of kind of spread betting trading, and into a sort of a more established office. And there's this old guy called Mr. Partridge who has his kind of chin sort of stuck on his chest. And Livermore's trying to work out why he's not making money like he used to make in the shops. And because he's always missing the trade somehow. And then he's watching this guy. And this guy's, people coming up to the guy and he'll have a big position in whatever it is, US Steel. Someone say, I've just heard this about the combine and they're going to be selling some. And Partridge would say, yes, thank you very much. It's very, very good information. I'm sure you're right. And then not change his position, stay long. and the reason he'd do that is because he was looking at the longer term trend. And it was Livermore learnt from that it's the long trend that makes you the big money. And that's why I'd have him on my island.
Oh, that's awesome. That's a terrific answer. All right, so let's learn a little bit more about Macroscope. Tell us about your shop, who it appeals to, like how they can learn more information. Give us the whole spiel.
Yeah, no, sure thing. So the three kind of writing partners, kind of James Ferguson, Andy Leese, and myself. And we also have kind of a sales team, Michael Wilson and Victoria Wilson, and so on. But the three kind of analysts, if you like, writing partners, we've all had kind of 20 years plus of experience kind of on the buy side and the sell side. And we were all ultimately too grumpy to work in big businesses, and even too grumpy to work in the same office. So we were all working separate offices. Because we just have this natural tendency to be independent and not to want to be constrained. And so I reckon if I'd stayed at my last job, I've been at MacroStrategy for about a decade, I'd probably been sacked about 15 times by now, because I'd have just ended up with a different view than the China Economist, and they wouldn't have wanted me to publish on that, and so on. And so basically what we do is, with that experience, we kind of do bottom-up work. We use public domain work to try and identify how we think the world's working. And when that's different from how the market thinks it's working, then it starts getting interesting. And especially when even though we allow each other to be independent, I'm independent of Andy and James, when we happen to end up on the same page, but having started from different premises, then the message is even more powerful. And so that, I think, is something that just has to be lacking in investment banks, because you have to toe the line in anything that's not your direct kind of view. So what we do is we kind of write a thematic daily. Andy writes that. We each publish a couple of pieces per month, like independent kind of thought pieces per month. And myself and my colleague James Ferguson do kind of update videos on the back of that. And then we, and that's the kind of primary product that we put out. Obviously, we're free for meetings, etc. as well. And I think it's kind of the fact that we're independent, sometimes contrarian, but not always. It's when you have that position that the potential big trades, the sort of 10-year trades, they can come to the fore. And I think we're just about to enter one. I think we're in an investment regime shift where we're going to move away from kind of the disinflationary boom of tech and the US dollar tending to win. And we're going to move to much more of a reflationary, inflationary environment over the next 10 years, where the big winners are going to be India, Vietnam, resources, and even blue-collar workers within the States. And I think those kinds of conclusions aren't really possible if you're working in your silo in an investment bank.
All right. So where can they find more about it? And is it geared towards family offices, institutions, or is there a retail component?
There's not a real retail component.
Okay.
But what we basically have about 220 clients, and there's a mixture. And most is I'd say 80% is hedge fund institutional. There's about 10% family offices, 5% ultra high net worth individuals and 5% like central banks and company corporates. And yeah, if you look us up on macrostrategy.co.uk or send either myself an email, Julian, Julien, at macrostrategy.co.uk, or our head salesperson, Michael Wilson, Michael at macrostrategy.co.uk, then you can get in touch and we'll set you up with a free trial and a look at our stuff to see if it suits you.
Right. So go to macrostrategy.co.uk to learn more about the product. Julian, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure having you on. We'll have to get you back on to talk about India and the next big trade.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you very much.
All right. Cheers. Bye then.
All right, Patrick, talking charts. And just for a reminder, we're doing this Thursday afternoon.
Yes.
So it won't be the typical Friday afternoon when we do this. We're a whole day early. So if I don't know if Friday ends up being another ripper and we end up looking like idiots, or if we get the Black Friday or whatever, just be aware.
Oh, listen, it's Thursday when we're recording this, and we can only talk about the charts from what we see. So, you know what? First of all, when we were doing this session, when I was a few weeks ago, we were talking about how this market was at ridiculously elevated levels, but it was in a bull trend, and it was, completely resilient. Nothing could take this market down. No government shutdown, no nothing. But Trump did it. And Trump started. Well, obviously China started it, and Trump reacted with the rare earths announcement, and the market goes out and has a peak to trough drop of 4%. Now, that wasn't what was on the end of the day, but it was the beginning drop on the downside. Since then, we've bounced. There's a couple of dynamics going on. First of all, it's OPEX week, and we're still stuck in the 6,700 strike zone. There's a lot of gamma pinning that can still go on, but a lot of that starts to roll off tomorrow. And so the fact that the market bounced a bit here into this OPEX is very much in line with that kind of a scenario where the options flow could have driven this. But we're now literally going to go into next week without that being a factor. And so one of the things that we want to talk about is, did something change when this drop happened here on Friday? It was something different. Well, at minimum, what I feel like we've done, Kev, is we've transitioned into a distribution cycle. And the way I frame it at Big Picture Trading is we look at markets in accumulation cycles, bull cycles, distribution cycles, and then bear cycles. So there's actually 4 phases, not just bullish and bearish, but there's transitory periods where they're transitioning from bull and bear. And an imperfect example of that is topping formations and technical analysis, where if we look here back in November through February, the market stopped making higher highs, traded sideways. All the rallies all the sell-offs immediately rallied, but it was always met with distribution, and the market stopped making any progress higher. And what I feel like we have at minimum seen here is the beginning of this kind of period where the stock market, this rise of 5 months in a row, just relentless rises. It's transitioning now to a period where we're going to see market topping formations develop that will inevitably lead to a deeper correction on that. What's your thoughts?
Well, I can't disagree with any of that, except for the fact that you blamed it on Trump. And I have a little bit of pushback on that, because although I agree he was the catalyst, I would argue that the extended overbought nature of the markets, where the CTAs were all like 100th percentile longs, the vol control had gotten to a point where it was implicit in the pricing was a continued low vol environment. The massive amounts of enthusiasm out there in terms of folks just biting at the bit to own stocks, this belief that it was impregnable and there was no way that we were going to get a decline. It was just waiting for something. And
Right.
it's
But it
always,
wasn't a government shutdown. Like there were headlines that could have
yeah.
been the
I
triggers,
think
but
though
they
that the
weren't.
government shutdown, I think the market is realistically understood that that doesn't really mean
Yeah.
anything. Like it's
Yeah.
the people asked me about the government shutdown a couple of weeks ago, and I said it doesn't matter, and I don't believe it does. Maybe at some point it'll matter, but it used to be a bigger deal. They used to worry about like them not being able to go over the debt ceiling limit and for them to do a technical default, and there was all sorts of other things. I think the market's just completely understands that this is just, Washington politics, and they ignore it and they just kind of dismiss it. But I agree that although the Trump news, people, I'm sure people listening will say, no, the Trump news is a big deal. And I get it. It is a big deal, but there was going to be something coming along that the
Yeah.
market
You know,
was going to use as an excuse. And it happened to be that. In another, 2 months ago, that Trump news might have just got shrugged off because it
yeah.
wouldn't have been so overbought, and it wouldn't have been a situation where the vol control folks would have ended up being selling, where the CTAs weren't 100% long, where everyone.
But Kev, I personally think that we haven't seen a CTA trigger yet. That sell-off there was obviously a reactionary one that was where a lot of kind of traders with incredibly tight stops that were looking for a pivot were leaned into. But usually CTAs need more than a 3 or 4% market drop. And even then, that 3 to 4% drop would have to actually sustain. I mean, we basically are only 1-2% off of the highs at this moment. In order for us to see true kind of downside volatility where the CTAs are triggered, at minimum, we should be breaking down greater than even 5%, where we start doing real technical damage on the charts, where all of their quant models and other things that they're using will actually create the sell cycle that sells. So I actually don't think we've even seen the quants make any quants, the CTAs make any meaningful pivot yet.
Well, maybe you're right
And
on the CTAs, but like the vol control, if you pull up the S&P 500 vol control index and you just pick like at random, I got it in front of me. Let's just pick the 10 target vol exposure. It was 0.97 on Friday. It's down to 0.72.
yeah,
Like it degrossed kind of 25%.
right.
In 2 days or 3 days. So it's happening. Like
Yeah.
there was some selling, and not only that, there was a lot of folks that were long. And then the interesting thing about it, I was talking to a friend about this, and we were kind of noticing the fact that over the past couple of weeks, we've been getting a lot of flack in terms of people calling me the grumpy old man yelling at clouds is what I've called myself, like a GOMYAC. And I was looking at the chart, and yes, you could make fun of us and say that this is the case, and you're missing out all the the rally into the end of the year. But in the space of like a day, everyone that had bought in those previous 2 weeks was offside.
Yeah.
It doesn't take very much, and that's the scary thing about this environment, is that we could turn around tomorrow, we could be down another, like let's just say another 3% or something like what we experienced last time, and then all of a sudden all the buying, everything that you've all that's this buying and this accumulation, as you point out, as being distribution, it's been people's the strong hands selling it to the weaker hands, and I'm very skeptical that we're going to get this rally that everyone's so convinced of into year end. Like, tell me somebody who does, like, now finally some folks are getting a little more worried about the rally into year end. But let's just take a week ago, before Trump said anything. Did you know anybody that didn't think we were rallying into year end?
Yeah. But you know what's interesting about that is that when you put it in the frame of the pain trade, so the pain trade being how can the market make the most amount of people wrong as possible and use that as your starting base case. The reality is when we were back in the summer in July and August, the one thing, and even I was guilty of it, where a lot of people, well, the seasonality of the market means September and October are the highly vulnerable periods for the market to turn. I could imagine there was a very large amount of hedging being done into the traditional seasonal period of September, October. Here we are, October expiration. So anyone that was back in August buying an October hedge is literally about to roll off at the time when you need the hedge the most.
Good point.
And
great point, Patrick. And probably
so
not going to buy it again because they're so convinced we're going rallying into year end.
Or simply that that risk window is passed. So wouldn't it be ironic is that literally we go past the September, October hedging window where everyone from a seasonality was hedged up to, and suddenly they don't re-hedge into November and then they get their feet cut out from underneath them. It would be interesting if all of those hedges all rolled off like that, right?
Yeah, great point. I never thought about that.
And so that's why I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens next week once we're past this monthly OPEX on that option front. By
the way, before we continue, I have a very smart subscriber client that I have the privilege of talking to. I remember going into September, and I was, I've been worried/bearish way too early, because I've been at least saying that for the past month. And he said to me, it just feels like everyone's worried about the seasonality. And I remember him specifically saying that to me. And I'm thinking to myself, you know what? Maybe he's right. And I think you are correct that there was too many folks talking about that. Goes to show you, Patrick, if everyone's worried about something, that's the least time that you should be worried about it.
Absolutely. It's you always have to look at what is the consensus view and recognize that the tail risk is always on the consensus pivoting.
Yeah.
Right. And but what's interesting about this price action and the way the market dropped here, let's look at just the chart here and this way this bounced. It reminds me a lot of what happened back over here over Christmas. We had that December 18th market drop day where the market basically went from peak to trough about almost a 4% drop, about 250 S&P points. Trump was already in office at the time, but the market was rallying up until that moment. And then what happened in the few days that followed was basically a rally that got the market almost back up to its highs. And what was interesting here is that the market proceeded to have numerous attempts to rally back up to their highs, creating a very classic topping formation and a distribution cycle along the high. Now, I'm not necessarily trying to forecast that has to repeat itself, but it is an important lesson that just because we're bearish and we feel that the outcome will be to the downside, sometimes the market takes a little bit longer than most people expect for the downside to really crack. And I'm curious whether or not we're going to be able to sustain the first wave down in this market. Like, wouldn't it be an interesting scenario if this market came in with like one of these less than 10% drops, like a 7-8% drop, let's say 6,300 or something like that. The market then proceeds going into late November, December for a double top retest, and everyone just gives up on this hedging shit. Everyone just like says, you know what, this hedging shit doesn't work. I'm spending all this money. The market never really followed through and I never saw my payday. And then really after putting in some topping thing, then we have a Christmas massacre in December or something.
Oh,
like
you're saying Santa's bringing in a bag of coal?
I'm not forecasting this. I'm just going through the pain trade scenarios of like what could basically happen to make the most amount of people get it wrong. Because a lot of times at market tops, everyone, like, it's very hard to catch a market top because at the top, the anxiety and confusion gets to its maximum. Yes. Fake out moves, volatility going the wrong way, a quick drop, big buy on dip opportunity, you faded this and that. And what happens is you just get so overwhelmed by what's going on that you can't step back and see what's actually about to happen. And most people are never prepared for when the actual turn happens.
And Patrick, to that point, volatility often increases, and you alluded to that. You get a 5% down move, and then you get a 5% rip right back up. and everyone thinks, oh, look, it was a buy on dip, and then that sags, and then everyone's still in buy and dip mode, and they don't recognize that the nature of the market is turned. I completely agree, and you've really highlighted how the increase in volatility makes it really tough to filter out through, like, to eliminate the noise and to see what's happening.
Absolutely. But what we do have is a VIX that's now hovering legitimately above 20. So now the vol premium of buying insurance is definitely picked up. So now the downside hedging is getting more expensive. But this is, to your point though, we're going to have heightened volatility. The swings are going to get bigger. And the question becomes is like, will all these vol targeting funds have to start degrossing? Will the CTAs start getting signals? When will the dealers start having their gamma flip levels really get tested? There's going to be a number of stress points that will inevitably emerge that we have to be aware of. But one thing though, while I think that next week can be quite volatile, I just think that anyone who's planning their big short on this market really has to step back and reflect that, if you think it's just going to happen in a 30-day window, you may be, the market may be setting up to frustrate the shit out of you. You have to have the right time horizon to see through what will be inevitably a turn that is very likely going to be a big downside move.
Yeah.
But it's just going to shock everyone how long it takes to get there.
I remember our buddy Morris Sachs used to talk about that. He says in bear markets, bulls and bears, neither one of them make money. And the reason he would talk about that is because you would get these vicious rallies. People would get, bearish, and they get short, and then the thing would rally up on them and stuff like it. And it's a difficult game, like, no doubt about it.
So a couple of things I want to highlight about we've discussed last time about the markets. First of all, the breadth of the market continues to deteriorate. During that drop on Friday, we got to 35% of stocks above their 50-day moving average. I mean, 65%, basically 2 out of 3 stocks in the S&P were actually below their longer term trends. They were downtrending basically. Now it's back to 47%, but here we are, a market a stone throw away from its all-time high, and you have more stocks in a decline than are rising. The fact that we have seen this type of deterioration in breadth happening throughout the last couple months is very typical along market tops, which is that there's a thinner and thinner leadership of stocks that are driving the momentum, and the broader base of stocks stop participating and taking flows. And this continues to be evident. And this is like that kind of market rotting is there. Like while we did have a little December event in breadth, you can observe that the breadth kept deteriorating over and over again until we got the Liberation Day drop, which got us down to like only 5% of stocks above their 50-day moving averages. Point though is that the breadth kept getting worse and worse for months in that deterioration, and this is clearly evident here. What is interesting as well is that, like, for instance, today we got the news on the regional banks, the Xeon and things like this, but the regional banks were pretty much in a nice clean bull trend, higher highs, higher lows. And then they came for a direct retest of their previous highs. This pretty much qualifies like a double top to me. And we now have a legitimate reversal breakdown where it's no longer even holding a Fibonacci zone. And so what's interesting though is a lot of the major banks actually had earnings beats, right? And I'm just going to use Bank of America as an example, but we've had a couple of these banks, actually the big not the regionals, but the large money center banks had these nice beats, but the regional banks are under stress. And I'm trying to determine whether or not the way these financials are behaving is a tell in any way. What's your thoughts there? Anything?
I think that they're behaving like crap. Like, pull up the KRE, you look at it, it's breaking below It's moving average. It's looking like it broke support. It looks terrible. And a lot of it has to do with this First Brands thing. And a lot of smart folks are messaging me saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. And this is just the start of a lot of credit issues. I know as well, in terms of plumbing, we're seeing some signs of stress in the repo market for the SRF getting taken down. There's all sorts of worrisome signs out there, Patrick.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of amazing at how complacent everyone is about the risks here, because to me it feels like
when you're making money, it's easy to be complacent. This is the nature of how investing works. It's like when you're making the money, you generally are not worried. It's when you're losing the money and you ask, like, what the fuck's going on, right?
Yeah, I guess so. It seems to me that when an asset's become more expensive, you should be more worried about it going down, not less. And when an asset becomes, cheaper, you should be more, more willing to buy it. Like, what's the line from Warren Buffett? It's like being greedy when others are fearful and be fearful when others are greedy. Exactly. Sure seems like to me that this is the time to be fearful, not the other way around.
So just a quick thing, and I don't want to pivot to bonds just yet, but one of the interesting things that we've talked about in the past was the correlation of junk bonds to equities, in the sense that there's been a lot of 5% market corrections where junk bonds haven't reacted, but almost all of the 10+% market corrections, that the deeper, more pronounced corrections, almost certainly have junk bond credit also declining. And what's interesting is what kind of a solid bull run that junk had for the last 4 months. Right? Like it was just an epic run. And that Friday was the first time we've seen junk bonds start to react. Now, this is not a bearish chart like KRE yet, but this is the thing to watch in the next couple of weeks. Like, are we going to see that junk bonds are going to start to get heavy here and start to roll? Because I still think that if this is going to be destined to be a greater than 10% correction, that the junk bonds will give us a tell here. And on that, do you agree with this?
Oh, Patrick, couldn't agree more. And in my little recap that I send out, I highlighted the fact that recently Howard Marks, a guy who knows a thing or two about investing, pulled the trigger on his put provision to Brookfield on his firm, meaning that they sold the rest of their firm to Brookfield. And the thing about it that was kind of really interesting was it was only a year or two ago that Brookfield thought that the guys from Oaktree would never do that they would always own their piece. And here they are, sticking Brookfield with their credit kind of management firm. And it just conjured up the same thoughts about, or the reminding me about Sam Zell selling equity office properties at the all-time high in REITs. And I went and pulled up the charts. I was actually shocked. Do you know that the equity office properties came off the board the day that the Dow Jones REITs index topped, and it was straight down from there? And so when I look at this, it just reminds me of it, like smart, grizzly, wise old guys like Howard Marks are selling. Meanwhile, everyone else is getting all excited about it and saying what a great investment opportunity is, and he's selling. And one of the things that you should always remember is watch what they do, not what they say. And when I see things like Howard Marks selling, it makes me think that this credit bond market might be in trouble.
All right. You heard it from Kevin. I love it. I never knew that. And I'm glad you brought it up. I think that a lot of our listeners will appreciate that little insight. All right. So listen, we got to move on because it's clear what we're thinking on the equity markets, but we got to talk about some of these crazy bubbles going on in the markets. First of all, actually, before we get to the precious metals, I wanted to quickly talk about the other thing that I think is the most important thing to talk about is the dollar. But you're shocked, right?
No,
but
for those who don't know, Patrick Eustace put that always in the top 3 things But he doesn't talk about it as much anymore. You've kind of gone off of that.
Sure. But I actually think if the US dollar is going to rip here, it matters. But what I was actually particularly wanting to bring up was the fact that I'm shocked actually where we are on implieds on the currency options. Like the euro on the euro futures going out 5 months, we were down to like 6.6 implieds. And during higher vol periods like 7 to 9% are incredibly common, and so like we're trading on some what I think is a relatively cheap vol on the currencies. And the one thing I'm thinking, I don't know, you can check on your Bloomberg whether
I am.
you
I'm
see the
pulling it
same
up
thing.
right now. I think you're right.
Are you
6.8 at the
seeing?
money.
Yeah, but are you?
I did a
are you
6
seeing?
month. I did a 6 month euro dollar at the money, and it's 6.8%, and it's at the low end of the range.
Yeah, low end of the range, exactly. And so one of the things I'm debating here is whether or not this vol is right priced. Like when you put all these event risks and all of this different things that can happen in the markets, the chances of outsized currency moves it increases. And yet they're pretty much giving you the convexity here pretty cheap. And I'm curious, like whether or like can the euro in 5 months move more than 2 cents on the downside? I mean, even a 50% retracement here. I'll put up the euro. Even a 50% retracement in the euro is down to 112. That's a 500 pip move on the downside. To me, I just feel like that these options, you don't even have to make a crazy call on the currencies and take huge delta one risk on this. These options are actually are very reasonably priced for the conditions of that we're going into. I think that if things really got spicy, there's no reason why the dollar can't have a 500 to 1,000 pip rip just based on flows.
Yeah, Patrick, I've been arguing this for a while, and it's just so far it hasn't worked. But I continue to believe that the foreign exchange currency vol market is one of the most underappreciated asset classes out there, and that at some point this trade war will turn into a currency war. And when that happens, you're going to want to own these vols. And I think you go out as long as you can. You own the far dated stuff so you don't get the theta monster burning you, like scratching at your door all the day, and you just own this thing. Because I'm with you. I suspect that we're going to get some wild, crazy moves, and I don't know which ones in which way, but I suspect that there's going to be more vol in the dollar than we think.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about what I'm sure everyone wants to talk about, and that's what the frick is going on with gold. It's parabolic. I know you've been calling for a fucking decade this $1,000 up day. Well,
you haven't even known me for a decade, so don't.
Dude, since I remember you, like
I did always say that was my thing. We would have $1,000 up week. I don't think we're going to get it. Because I feel like this is it, and I don't feel like.
I mean, look, if we got $1,000 up 2 months.
Yeah.
So, okay.
So I was a little hyperbolic. I was trying out for the Macro Voices show at the time.
Yeah, exactly. But we are now actually in the accelerated parabolic phase of this advance. And the one thing that, we've talked about parabolic advances numerous times on the show over the last 5+ years. And this one is just not going to be any different. It's not that gold isn't going to eventually be 10,000 or 15,000 over a long enough time period as a huge, fiat currency debasement is happening over the long term. But when things accelerate in these parabolic fashions, it attracts substantial amounts of leverage in futures markets, in option gamma, and all these different things that actually add like fuel, accelerating the underpinning bullish things like central bank buying. And inevitably, on the other side of this, there often pullbacks are as violent as the rises that preceded them. And so this gold rise, now that we're entering parabolic, who knows? We could see 4,500, 4,800. We could see 5,000, 6,000. I'm not necessarily thinking that crazy, but like these parabolic rises, they just keep going and shock everyone how far they go and how fast they get there. But like I want to go back and look at the rise of gold in that kind of phase leading up into 2011, where it was a pretty bullish kind of parabolic rise period on gold. And when gold made that rise from like 21 to 2,600 in that final stage of that thing, the subsequent market drop in the next month had it give back the entire initial rally, or the last phase of the rally. Point being is that the drop on the downside was arguably even more violent than the final rise. And these things can turn. And I just don't think gold will be any different. And it won't change any of the bullish reasons to be bullish in the long term. Like we're about to see some huge gold vol. And I think that when this blows off, we could easily have even 500 to even 700 on the downside just from flow dynamics.
Yeah. I don't really have anything to add. At this point, everyone's become a gold expert. We're at this stage where it's become manic. Will it keep going? Who knows? I don't know. I feel like for me, the value add is talking about it before these things happen, not during them happening. So, for the gold bulls, enjoy the ride. Let's hope it keeps going. And I'm not disagreeing that it's getting more and more dangerous. And the only thing I would say is, if you're looking at your position and you look at it on a vol basis, you should probably be making sure it's not growing too much, because not only is it going up in terms of your notional amount, it's also going up in terms of the vol. So that would be the only thing I would tell people is, great. I hope everyone's long, and I hope everyone, practices safe gold investing.
The way that we're approaching it at Big Picture Trading is we're converting. So a lot of our leap positioning. So we were up like 300, 400% on a bunch of these leaps that were going on the upside. And the problem is these things are all approaching Delta 1.
Yeah.
They're literally synthetic equities. And the problem is that you're therefore you lost all the convexity of the leap. And you're now basically taking on almost all that long exposure direct if there's that downside volatility. And so what we've been doing is actually closing the leap positions and replacing them with bull call spreads, going only even 1 month out. And so what happens is you can reconstruct the payoff structure where you could still get 2-to-1 and 3-to-1 payoffs on bull call spreads, continue to participate on the upside, but having locked the vast majority of your gains in. And that's sort of the way I'm looking at it. You don't want to short this bubble, but you need to have some sort of way to reset the asymmetry of the trade to be able to keep participating on the upside.
Right. And one of the things that I do that in terms of trying to keep your bend with like the convexity that you talk about is like, let's just imagine you were buying this back in November of 2024 when gold was 2,600. Let's just imagine you bought a $3,000 call, right? And you were buying 2-year $3,000 calls. And the reality is that now, as you rightfully point out, Patrick, that $3,000 call is almost a delta of 1, meaning it's just trading 1 for 1 with the gold price. So you're stuck with this thing where you've lost all the bend. It's just become a straight 1. So one of the things that I do at times when I'm thinking about taking a long-term position is that back when I was buying the $3,000 call, I might buy some 3,000s, some 3,200s, some 3,500s, 3,750s, 4,000s. And that way, if I'm and they get progressively cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And that way, if it keeps going, I don't lose the bend, if you understand.
Yeah.
Because you still have some new ones. So that's just something to think about.
But do you trim off the deep in the monies and just keep riding? Like you almost reset your delta dollars in terms of what your exposure is?
So yeah, and sometimes that's what I'll do, and so I'll buy.
I
don't
never
even
thought
know
of
what
that, but
that's
that's a great
called,
idea.
but yeah, but that's one of the
Well, I
things that I
mean-
like to do. I saw someone. I'm not sure what a Christmas tree is. I don't know.
No, but that's the upside down. That's, I think, that Christmas tree is like the, I'm not going to pretend like I'm.
Is there
but
some-
it's like you're basically staggering on the lower strikes by getting larger and larger on the farther and farther out of the money strikes. But I guess you could do a reverse.
Well, anyways, we got to come
tree.
up. We got to come up with a name for this. But that's what I like doing, because I think that
like
losing your bend is actually more of a problem, and it's a good problem to have. But it is a difficult problem, and that's in essence what's happened to you right now. Is you've lost your bend, and not only that, because it's gone and shot up here so fast, vol is more expensive now to pay up for.
Yeah.
So that's why you buy it there. Okay.
So next, crude oil, quite bearish.
Oh, Patrick, I'm loving this bearishness. I'm loving it.
Well, listen, you could love it. I know you're like the Emperor in Star Wars, and you just like let your hate flow through me, like whatever shit you do. But for me, what I only care about is when do we transition from bearishness to accumulation? Like where is that kind of basing thing? Right now, this is still, unfortunately, in outright bear mode, which is like lower lows persistently in sell mode. And I'm curious, like, whether or not this is simply going to retest previous lows. Like, where are we going to bang out the bottom? Like, I get that long-term bull thesis. I know so many of our guests come on and share this idea. The key thing here is about when does it transition into that next bull phase? Right now, this unfortunately doesn't have any major support lines anywhere here. We could easily still shave off 10% on the downside on this. Now, will it be a epic buying opportunity? I'd like to think yes. But right now on the short term, it's hard to make any bull argument other than everyone's bearish.
Yeah. Well, you know me, that's often enough.
That's often enough.
but I'm with you. Listen, and I'm picking away. I'm starting to think about things and how to position for this. And what I'll probably do is start picking away at it. I won't buy like my full position, and then when you tell me that things have gone to the positive from the tech side, technical analysis side, then I'll jump on and do it in a big way.
I like it. The I'm just trying to cherry pick some of the commodities we're talking about. Will natural gas here hold the support line? This is obviously in line with the oil thing. Look, there's always room here. I'm using the UNL, which is the strip, just so that we avoid having to play the term structure game. Is there still possibility that head of an inverted head and shoulder happens where this thing still has one more round of weakness for a couple of weeks? It's plausible. I still think the bottom of nat gas is going to come in here. But the fact that we gave back the entire bull breakout in one fluid motion like this is a short-term setback. It means that the starting gun did not fire and the race did not begin. And we're still in some sort of basing accumulation phase of this security. And so we're going to be watching closely what this does here. But this sets it back for the short term. Maybe it's going to have to take November or December to start turning this chart back up.
The other thing, Patrick, that I think is interesting is that folks will say to me, well, Kev, you're bearish on the economy, so why are you bullish oil? And they're kind of correct if you think about it from like an economic point of view. If I think the economy is going to be weaker, why would I think that oil is going to go up? And there's obviously a lot more going on, but I do believe that there's a certain amount of correlation in games that are played with the people's books. And so if we got a situation where we did get a major correction in the stock market and the economy turned, I suspect that investors would sell all the stuff they're long and go out and buy all the stuff that they're underweight. And as strange as it sounds, I think economic weakness could actually see the nat gas and the oil market going up.
But do you think nobody's is that thesis on the commodity or on the equities?
I think it's actually both. I don't think it's I think it works on both. And there's lots of times if you go look at nat gas, it seems to be negatively correlated to the stock market. And I don't understand why. I don't really have a ton of theories, but you'll see times when the stock market gets into real troubles, the nat gas goes bid for the day. It could be one of these things that it's a kind of a carry trade. The hedge funds end up being short because it's a little bit like shorting VIX futures. It just pays over time. I'm not sure, but I definitely think that there's something there, and you should keep your eyes on that.
There you go. All right. One thing I wanted to touch on here, platinum and palladium, both of them have literally finished measured moves and these parabolic rises. What's interesting is that whether it's silver, platinum, palladium, or gold, they actually are all doing the exact same thing at the same time, which to me means that I think that they're all going to correlate. When we see a short-term blow off top on this, then they're all going to move together. I don't think that any of these are marching to the beat of their own drum anymore.
Okay. I can't wait for you to get to bonds.
Well, okay, let's get to bonds. Actually, by the way, before we do, let's talk one more thing. Okay. Wheat.
Oh my God. I guess that's because they can't sell anything, right? Like American farmers are basically getting shut out around the world, and we're looking at wheat priced in for delivery in the US.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that none of these are going anywhere. I'd be curious if you went and looked at a more global wheat, like is there a Brazil wheat or Brazil soybeans?
A great example of that is, let's say, looking at copper in the US, which has obviously had the tariff pop and drop, versus you look at the LME grade A copper in London. And I mean, we're virtually at this beautiful bull chart on global copper prices. And, when you're talking the reflation trade, if you're looking at the HG, you're not really getting a good pulse on what global copper is doing. You're getting messed up with all the COMEX shit that was driven by all the
but it's made even worse because at least copper you can store, I think. I think copper stores, but does it store forever? Is it like gold?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some things you can't store forever, like that they oxidize or whatever. I'm not sure, but anyways, you can store for a while.
That's why you can use it for copper pipes and shit like this.
Oh yeah, that's right. Okay.
It's got a long life. But anyway, so let's talk about bonds.
Okay.
And let's talk about.
I have something that I want to get off my chest eventually.
The 10-year yield under 4%.
Okay.
It's under 4%. And more importantly, other than the one brief day where it closed below 4%, or actually never even closed below 4% back during the Liberation Day, it just traded below 4% and opened below 4%, but it never actually closed there.
Yep.
And so if we close here, this is the lowest closing price on the yield in 2025. You have to go back to September, October of last year to see lower yields. So bonds are clearly on the uptick. But what's interesting is that all of this chaos has certainly stirred up the stir traders. Because you have the 2026 December SOFR future right back to its highs. And that's what we're seeing here is that literally it doesn't matter whether you're talking 2-year bond, 10-year, or the 30-year, you are seeing money flowing into bonds straight out.
Okay. So Patrick, as you know, for the past couple of months, I've been telling you that I am flat. You know me.
Don't say it. Don't say
it.
No,
I'm not. I am not long bonds, so you don't have to worry yet.
Thank God.
Okay. But I am just laughing myself silly because I remember back in January of 2022 or February, I wrote this piece and it was really, bearish bonds. And it was all about the reflation trade and all about what potentially could go wrong. And people told me I was an idiot. I got all this terrible flack. And there was just no, you don't understand. Rates always go down. yada, yada, yada. Okay. Fast forward to today. And by the way, 2021 and 2022 were the two worst years, or 2022 ended up being the worst year in the bond market. I think it might have been ever
in a century or something.
Yeah. So
ridiculous.
it ended up being those folks were really wrong. I am laughing myself silly because I go and I look on Twitter and someone says you should buy bonds. Okay. And the kind of debasement degens jump all over them and tell them they're going to be so wrong and that there's like, we're going to reflate and all this stuff. And it just looks like the mirror opposite image of what we experienced in 2022. Back then, everyone was completely convinced that you had to own fixed income and that there was no way that rates were going to stay, go up and all that stuff. And now it's the exact opposite. I saw Bob Elliott get there and he said something and people were literally like laughing at him. And anytime I see a group of traders getting laughed at on Twitter for their views and their outside consensus, I know we're getting close.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I can bring myself to own bonds, Patrick. And maybe I won't do it just to help you out. But I want to. I want to own bonds. I actually want to own bonds.
Well, listen, just compromise. Just at least throw some TUA in your account or some leverage 2 years, because then you know what? Because then you're playing Fed policy and not really the long.
Well, there's a lot in there too, though. So one of the other things that I was laughing about was so I have this credit trade spread on that hasn't worked, and so I'm basically short the CBOE, HY and IG bond products, and I'm long the fives against it in essence, so that I isolate and just end up with just the only thing is credit. And a couple of times, Patrick, I felt like dirty about like having the fives on because I'm technically long, although there's no real duration risk. So I was like, oh, maybe I should take it off because like I'm like sitting there, and now I'm looking at the P&L and I'm like, oh my God, am I so thankful I didn't screw that up by going and taking that, like lifting that part of the hedge, because there's nothing goes more wrong than when you lift a leg trying to fix a bad trade, right? Like, but anyways, the long and short of it is, Patrick, I'm with you. I don't know how or why, but I think that the bearishness on bonds is just overwhelming and that we are going to be surprised that they do much better than folks expect.
Well, I mean, I just feel that while I respect the conversations that you have often with some of our, really smart guests, and you guys go through the hypothetical scenarios of when stocks, bonds, and the dollar can all go down at the same time and all these different theories, those theories at some point may come to fruition. I'm not saying that you can't be right at some point, but there are general intermarket rules and relationships that take unique circumstances for them to diverge, and typically the flow into bonds as a safe haven during a rotation when when big smart money is taking money off the table on equities, this natural flow happens. And so, anchoring that off the idea that bonds can go down at the same time as stocks, some will almost kind of foobar you with the most simple intermarket relationship that more often not works.
Well,
and
I'll push back a little there, because I actually think that when we do get the next one, they're going to run ahead and they're going to go and price in way more Fed cuts, and the long end is actually going to underperform. And I do believe that. So ultimately, I'm not a fan of going and buying 30s because I suspect the rates are going down. I'd much rather play for the fact that we have 100 basis points of tightening priced into the next year, and that when things really do finally roll over, we're going to quickly go to 200 basis points or something like that, right? Yeah. Which is something you've talked about, and you were correct to highlight, as that eventually what happens is the market runs ahead and then the Fed has to catch up. Yeah. And that'll be what happens. And I still do agree that the long end isn't the safety valve that it used to be. So I'm not gonna go all in and say you got to buy 30s. Having said that, one of the things that Bruce Kovner says, what I look for is a market that is not confirming consensus. And to me, consensus right now is that the debasement trade is going to make it so that you are going to lose money in treasuries. And Patrick, you pointed it out. It's behaving well. It's not behaving like everyone that's making fun of Bob Elliott on Twitter is actually like would guess.
Yeah. Fair enough. The last thing I want to pivot to here is looking at global equity. And what I particularly want to note is, at least as of this moment, this natural correlation of where kind of all global equity markets tend to correlate with the US market in some cases, it doesn't seem to be evident yet. Like the Nikkei, for instance, had a quick drop on Tuesday, almost immediately recovers. It still feels like the Nikkei is being well accumulated, bought on dip, and still working. You look at the Euro stock, that was a clean 50% retrace right down to its 50-day moving average, got immediately bought on dip, and more importantly, is legitimately holding out of the trade range that it's established over the last year. Suddenly we have a bunch of these global equity markets, and they still look like these are pretty darn bullish charts that actually could continue higher. And I don't know how to reconcile it, because I'm so nervous about what's about to happen in the S&P that I'm finding it hard to get myself to just look at the chart for what it is. The chart looks bullish. Like and I'm sort of like talking myself out of like taking positions here.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, go do a spread trade then. And Patrick, you're spot on correct. And I wrote that piece where I highlighted that the MSCI World ex-US had 3 times the Sharpe of the S&P 500 over the past year. And the reality is that the rest of the world looks a lot better than the US does. Yeah. And to me, what's happening is we're getting a global reflation. All the world is doing fiscal stimulus because Trump is, in essence, necessitated that they do it. And I think that's a good thing. A lot of these countries were starving their economies of fiscal stimulus. And so what we had is this global fiscal stimulus, and the whole world is reflating, and US stocks are going up at the same time, and everyone thinks that they're leading, and they're not. They're not the leaders. And that's
the AI bubbles is
sure.
But not the U.S. stock market. Like
no.
you have to isolate the one kind of little pocket. But like listen, I agree with you, and I want to highlight so like you can just use the EEM as an example. Sorry, which has got China in the basket, but like look at the way that's ripped this year. Like it's just
did that just go right to the tick almost of that moving average?
Yeah.
Wow.
Right. And just tested in but China still looks like, look how fast China recovered after the dip.
Yeah.
Look at the way so India just consolidated for a couple months and just doing a breakout candle like it's ready to begin its next leg higher. You take the Ibovitsa in Brazil, and I mean, it hasn't.
You say that really well.
Thank you, sir. But it came right to this moving averages. Is this going to be a buy on dip in this space? You take look at the way Mexico comes right to the moving average, right to just a basic 50% retrace, breakout candles. Like this is things ready to go.
It's almost like technical analysis works.
Okay, of course it does. Of course it does. This is why we talk charts, Kevin. But listen, the point I'm making though is that these global indices are, or these global different markets are actually way more bullish looking. And even though I'm so kind of like my anxiety level on that S&P so high, and I'm so bearish there that I'm having a hard time carrying any heavy longs in these other markets.
Got it. I understand. That's why
yet they're so bullish looking.
That's why trading is so tough, man. If it was easy, everyone would do it.
Is there something, Kevin, you asked us to guess all the time. Is there a question or a chart I should have looked at or asked
Oh
about?
my God, you
didn't?
actually listened to my interviews.
No,
I am
barely.
No,
What-
I have
what
nothing.
should we-
I want to go back to trading. This is the middle of the day, so let's call it a day.
All right. Well, listen, the fact that we recorded this on a Thursday guarantees that some shit show is going to happen tomorrow,
Yeah,
right?
we're going up or down 200 S&P points. One of the two.
Up or down. We just don't know which one.
We don't know which one. It's going. Listen, you got to keep your mind open for up too. Like it could possibly happen.
Absolutely.
All right, listen, bear market, bull market. We're just happy you guys spent some time with us on this ride. So now stick around for the after show. Okay,
All right.
Daniel. By the way, Daniel, before we start, I see you're in your van.
Yes.
Is it down by the river?
It's down by the ocean.
No, he's too
No,
young.
you know
to
what?
tell-
I know the song. Down.
It's not
by
a song. It's a skit from SNL. Chris
Oh,
Farley.
okay.
He lived in a van down by the river.
Oh, okay. I'll take that one. Maybe it was about me. Past life.
So you're down by the ocean, not down by the river. So what's everyone's? I'm going to go first. I love the beer. 9.5. This is lightweight. It's awesome.
Wow.
It's perfect. This is truly a sessionable beer.
I am going to give it I'm going to do the amateur score of 5.0. There
Seriously?
is nothing special about this beer. This beer is as ordinary down the center. It is totally drinkable and so ordinary. Like I
Just like me. Just
absolutely.
so ordinary.
It is just the most ordinary beer that I've had. I'm
Oh,
giving
God.
it a
5.0.
5.0 right down the center because it
What do you
just
think, Daniel?
deserves that.
I was actually going to give it the exact same score, which is really
Seriously?
funny. In fact, so bad that I'm going to go home and drink wine because I need to get that taste out of my mouth.
Oh, okay.
Oh my God.
That's
you
worse
guys
than me.
are
I was trying to
harsh.
be neutral. I was going to be neutral.
You guys
You're
are
you
harsh.
got to give it an under 5.
It was awful. It was not
Right.
nice at all. No.
Well, it's
So
also
it's like-
low cal.
I mean, like Coors Light would be maybe where it was something similar, but even Coors Light's better than that. That's
No, come on. You take that back. You take that back. I don't mind the 5-0 call, but calling this worse than Coors Light is too far.
I used to session that
that's
when
a
I
that's a
was,
that was a serious blow.
Yeah, that was.
Listen,
Okay, so
I
Patrick,
just need to do a shout out.
Oh,
Listen,
yes,
I
that's
just
right.
need to do a quick shout out.
Yeah.
Listen, so one of our huddle listeners, Chris, he goes under the Twitter handle CCE, and he knew I was out in Lisbon. He was visiting, and so he went out of his way to reach out to me. He is a beekeeper and makes his own honey, and he just wanted to drop off some honey for me. And I thought that was so awesome that a
That
listener
is so
would
kind.
do
So
that.
is he an
And so
American or
thank you, Chris.
Canadian? Where is he from?
Oh my God, I'm embarrassed to give you all the details. I don't know all the details.
Is he North American? At the very
I
least?
think he came from. You know what? I'll get you the details. I should have been prepared. I don't know the answers.
Yeah, you don't
But
know
anyway,
anything.
he was visiting to Lisbon, and he just went out his way, and I was grateful. So thank you, Chris, on that.
He's a
Nice.
beekeeper. Let me just look here. Looking up. That's his handle? CCE?
Hold on, I'll find it. Hold on a second.
You're like the worst shout out guy around.
Yeah.
Well, I
Yeah.
just wanted to say thank you, and
You
I
told-
wasn't prepared to
I
answer
know,
a
but
shitload
if
of
you're gonna be,
questions.
thank you. You gotta help the guy, get
No,
him some boosts, like some ratings, and like who knows? Maybe he
looking
sells
it
the
up.
honey.
I'm looking it up.
Have you tried the honey, by the way?
I didn't want to open it until it's the Twitter handle is once CCE.
there we
Okay.
go.
And does it say where he's from?
I'm looking. Hold on.
I don't want to look at Patrick's messages just in case. Oh.
Oh, there you go. I'll take that on this.
See if he sells
Last time
honey.
we shared.
He punts options a bit, keeps bees a bit, rides bike a bit, tests cricket fan. Oh no, he's not. Ex-life monkey. No. He's British,
Yeah.
or he's somewhere from Europe.
Yeah.
He's an old pit trader. No wonder. I love the guy.
There you go.
He's an ex-pit trader. He's like, he keeps bees. It's awesome.
Awesome. Anyway, you know what? I'm going to try it out. Thank you, Chris, so much for sending that out.
Okay. So now we got to talk South Africa.
Yes.
Okay.
Wow.
So did we? I can't remember. Did we? You said we were going to go to the sharks. Have we talked sharks already?
Oh, yeah, we did. We talked to sharks.
So we talked sharks,
but I went to the safari.
Yeah. So now we got to go to the next thing that the Playboy Ceresna did. Listen,
we did the whole thing. Like we went parasailing. We did the drifting, race car drifting. It's some kick-ass shit, but we got to talk to safari. So we went all the way to Kruger Park. We flew all the way down to the main park, and my mind was blown. I did not know what to expect, but this was a freaking complete Jurassic Park experience. And the one moment that actually was the absolute craziest was because we got to see everything, lions, everything. We got to see them all in this great event. But the one moment was we were driving down this trail, and there was a rhino right on the path.
Yeah.
And the driver's like all calm. And by the way, I got to deviate for a second.
Okay.
We had a driver with the coolest freaking name ever.
Okay, what is it?
His name was Panic.
Come on.
Literally spelled exactly panic. That like what mother
No, but was that his actual name?
That's his actual name. Like we checked his ID. Like we called him out on it. Like
if he has kids, they're going to be panicins.
They're going to be panicking, yeah.
Okay, so Panic, the driver, is driving us down this road, down a trail, and we turn and there's a rhino, and there's this huge, monstrous, fucking like 1-ton monster of a rhino sitting there. And at first, he's calm, everything's fine, we could all take pictures and shit like this. And then the rhino turns and looks, and he goes, "Oh shit!" And panics. Yeah, and he hits reverse, and he goes, "Gee!" And I'm thinking the entire Jurassic Park scene when they're being chased by the fucking T-Rex. Like I'm like, we're about to be fucking charged by a rhino, because like when Panic is panicking, something is going fucking astray. And
well, big shout out to Panic that he kept you guys alive. Do you think he's a listener?
No. No, he's not. But listen, I do want to say, anyone that ever wants one of the coolest life experiences, like going to the savannah and being out there in that nature and seeing the big five, like what's crazy is that the lions are so climatized to the vehicles that they were walking within a meter of the cars, and they did not give a shit that you were there. Like, and the coolest part was we saw these 3 lionesses actually hunting, and while we weren't there for when they made a kill, our other car full of other members, actually got to see them actually rip apart the prey and all run off with chunks of it and shit like that. Like they got to see like the real fucking safari ass shit.
Okay, so listen. Become a Big Picture member so that you can go on safari and see the poor gazelle get ripped to pieces and run off. Like
absolutely.
Bit by bit.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, on that note, we won't beat that. So everyone, safe trading. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Take care, everyone.